Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. Today I'm going to talk about comics as a visual medium because in my last video I covered a webcast where you had two women who were representing Marvel, and I would say Marvel Comics more specifically, and they were talking about comics as a visual medium. And I'll give you the context of what they were saying. You had Kelly Sue DeConnick, who is the person who created the current iteration of Captain Marvel, and she was saying that comics used to be for girls as well, and that with the advent of the direct market, you saw comic shops popping up, and comic shops were controlled primarily by men, and men started gatekeeping comics because they controlled the comic shops, and they pushed women and girls out of reading comics. Now, this is her actual argument. I'm not being dramatic. If you want to go listen to my previous video, I'll link it at the end where she says all this. But she makes some further points, and those further points are this. Number one, women and girls interact with the visual medium of comics in the exact same way that men and boys do. Number two, what they are doing now to get women and girls back into comics is not any kind of revolt, it is a restoration of the way things used to be. And number three, this restoration does not exclude men from comics in any way. Now, I'm going to show you in this video that her third point, that men are not being excluded from comics in the way that they are currently constructing them, is absolutely wrong. And the reason why it's wrong is because her number one premise, which is the fact that men and women interact with the visual medium of comics in the exact same way, is also fundamentally wrong. Now, I did a video a couple of weeks ago where I talked about the feminization of comics and how there was this feminine color palette for comics and how this use of this feminized color palette was actually driving men away from comics and, by the way, at the same time teaching their quote-unquote progressive ideology in a visual way. Now, when I said that, I got more than one person in the comments saying, well, you seem to be wearing your tinfoil hat today, and I don't fault anybody from actually thinking that. But this is an actual field of study, by the way. Now, what I studied primarily was how Western thought changed over time, and I did that through history and philosophy and political theory. And part of the political theory one was to examine the medium by which ideas are given to people and how that medium affects how they are perceived by these people. So this is exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about their choice of colors being feminized and actually promoting their ideology. This is part of an entire field of study, which is under the umbrella field of political theory most of the time. So, in order to argue against what this woman is saying, first I'm going to show you a little clip that encapsulates her argument. And it's only very short, and I apologize for having to assault you with this video, but I'm going to have to do so because what I usually do is just read the statement from a podcast, but I can't do that with this because I simply cannot reproduce the dismissive tone in her voice and the way that she is using her language. I just simply can't. So I'm going to play that clip for you right now.
And I've even heard, I've heard young men talk about, like, well, just women aren't really natural visual storytellers. I'm like, explain fashion. And like, that's just nonsense. You know, we're not, I don't have like female eyes, you know, like we're visual storytellers, or, you know, that's absurd.
So, although that was very short, it encapsulates the main body of her argument. And I'm going to use simple logic and empirical evidence from science to show you why everything she says here is incorrect and how this actually excludes men from reading comics, which she fervently denies in the later part of this webcast. So, first off, she is presenting a straw man argument. She is saying that she listened to young men talk about women not being visual storytellers. Now, I have never heard this claim ever before. I have made the claim, and there have been other people who have made the claim, that men are better visual storytellers, and there's scientific evidence to back this up. By the way, I'm going to try to link some scientific articles, or at the very least articles that talk about these scientific points in the description so that you can go and look these things up so that you don't have to take my word for it, and you know I'm not talking out of my hat when I give you all these points. So we know from science that men are inherently attracted to the visual more than women are. And because men are more attracted to the visual than women are, they interact with the visual more than women do. And because they have more experience interacting with visual mediums, because of this innate desire to interact more with the visual, then they become better visual storytellers. Because no one is saying that women can't be visual storytellers. No one is saying that women can't be good visual storytellers. Men are better visual storytellers because they simply have more experience with visual storytelling, because biologically they focus more on the visual than women do. So right off the bat, she's presenting a straw man argument, one that doesn't actually exist, and then she goes and knocks down the straw man to try to make it look like her point is correct. And right off the bat, she is being dishonest with what she is saying. Now, number two, she's trying to prove that women are just as good visual storytellers as men by using the example of fashion. Now, logically, this is just a non sequitur. This makes no sense whatsoever. Her basic argument can be broken down into the following. Premise A, visual storytelling employs a visual. Premise B, fashion employs a visual. Therefore, fashion is the same as visual storytelling. This kind of argument makes no sense. It's called a non sequitur argument. It makes no sense, and I'll show you why. I'll use the same form of argumentation to prove the following. Premise A, a man has 2 legs. Premise B, a kangaroo has 2 legs. Therefore, a man is a kangaroo. We all know this is ridiculous. This is a non sequitur argument, but this is the exact same form of the argument that she is using to try to prove that fashion is the same as visual storytelling, and women are good at fashion, and therefore they're good storytellers. This makes no sense whatsoever, because you can have 2 things, and they can share an accident, that is to say, a quality. These 2 things are visual storytelling and fashion, and they share a quality of using the visual. But that in no way means or implies that fashion is the exact same as visual storytelling. And since that little statement has been knocked down, then you can't claim that women are good visual storytellers because of fashion. It makes no sense. It's non sequitur. Now, let's move on to the other part of her argument, which is she does not see things with women's eyes, and she sees this as ridiculous. However, science does not agree with her. Not only are men's brains constructed biologically different from women's brains, but the eyes of a man and a woman are actually quite different. You have these cells within eyes called M cells and P cells, and men have more M cells and women have more P cells, and they are in the retina of the eye. So as soon as light actually hits the retina, it filters out that light and interprets the visual in a different way. So yes, as a woman, you do see things different than a man does. Yes, you do have women's eyes, and men do have men's eyes. So what these M cells do for men is that they are large cells, and they are distributed all over the retina. And what they do is that they help men filter out color noise so that they can concentrate on tracking movements of objects. Because women have P cells more in their eyes than men do. These P cells are concentrated around the center of the retina. They are smaller cells, and they are responsible for identifying objects, analyzing texture, and for perceiving color. This is exactly what they're for. So yes, women do have women's eyes, and men do have men's eyes, and they perceive things like color in a different way. And again, this has scientifically been proven through studies for the last 50 years. And by the way, this makes complete sense anthropologically, because you have men who are the hunters. And if you're a man and you're out in the forest or the jungle hunting, your eyes need to filter out all of the color noise so that you can see movement. So A, you can hunt something down to stay alive, and B, you don't get hunted down and get killed. You need those M cells that are scattered all across your retina so that you have A, good vision going forward, that you have B, good peripheral vision, and C, you can filter out all the color noise so that you can perceive all of this movement so you don't die and you actually hunt something down so that you can stay alive and eat. But with women, they are mothers because they're biologically set to have children. And so since they are set to have children, they're also set to care for children. And in being able to see more colors than men can and perceive those colors better, when they look at a child, they can tell slight variations in skin color and say, oh, my child is sick. I need to do something about it right away. This is what is going on. This is why men have different eyes than women. If you ever wondered why, when you were a boy, your mother looked at you and said, you're white as a sheet, you must be sick, and you went in and looked at yourself in the mirror and go, I don't see what you're talking about. Why did that happen? Because your mother can see more colors as a woman than you could as a boy. If you ever wondered why your girlfriend or your wife came up to you and said, no, dear, that's eggshell white. This is white over here. We want white, not eggshell white. Why can she do that? Because she can perceive more colors than you can. Quite simply, men's eyes are specifically set to concentrate on primary colors and filter out all of the color noise besides the primary colors, whereas women's eyes are set so that they can take in all of these different kinds of colors and see the gradation between one and the other. Now, to move on to the very last part of her argument, it's simply the derision in her voice. You'll notice how she just dismisses these ideas. But I've just shown to you that there has been science for 50 years to show that men do have different eyes than women, and women do have different eyes than men. So what is going on here? She has run across this argument that she does not like, and she is going to argue against. And in that intervening time between when she first heard this argument and this little webcast where she argues against it, did she actually go and look up anything to prove her point, to show that it is wrong? Well, there's only two options here. Number one, she didn't bother to go look anything up, because if she did, she would know scientifically that yes, she has different eyes. Or number two, she actually went and looked things up, found the scientific evidence, and is strictly ignoring it. And by the way, this woman, Kelly Sue DeConnick, she is a declared intersectional feminist. And feminists deny science all the time. There is this thing that feminists actually get together to do, at the very least annually. They have it scheduled. They all get together online and they do what is called an editing party. They go on sites like Wikipedia and find all the articles that scientifically show that there is a biological difference between men and women, and they edit all of these articles to erase all of the scientific data and to replace it with the ideological statement that the only reason there is a difference between men and women is societal, is because society has oppressed women and has elevated men. I'll actually put an article in the description if I can find one to show you, yeah, this is what they do. They are clear deniers of science. They specifically go out of their way to deny science. So I wouldn't put it past her if she actually knew these things, and she's not only ignoring them, but making fun of them in a way to show the other people that they don't actually exist. Now, let's look at all of that which I've just said and apply it to the medium of comics. So we look at comics, and we know that comics employ two different kinds of storytelling. There is normal textual storytelling, and there's also a visual storytelling. So let's be fair and just say there's 50-50 for each. It's 50% textual and 50% visual. Now, we know from science that men are more attracted to the visual than women are, and we know also from empirical data that women are more attracted to the textual than men are. I would say it would probably be 60-40, but you could push it to 75-25. So men are concentrating on the visual 65 to 75% of the time, where women only focus on the visual 40% to 25% of the time. So the visual in comic books is more important to men than it is to women. Now, in addition to this, we also know through science that women and men perceive colors differently. Men concentrate on primary colors. Women can see more than primary colors. And by the way that men see is concentrated around the tracking of movements. So there is a unique spot here held by comic books, because you have things like video games and television. They can use all of those colors because they're a medium where you have a moving visual, and because that visual is moving, men can interact and see those objects that are being portrayed better because there is movement. So they don't mind so much if there is this feminine color palette. But within comics, if you have this feminine color palette, which expands way beyond your primary colors, men are simply visually confused because their eyes are biologically not set up to deal with all of this, especially in a static way where there is no movement. So what happens when they construct comics in the way that she is talking about here? Let's concentrate again on this male color palette as opposed to the female color palette. If you have your older comics, they were just primary colors. And men interacted with those primary colors because that's the way men's eyes actually work. But the thing is that women could also interact with these comics because women can see these primary colors just the same as men can, but they also perceive all of these other different kinds of gradations of colors. So women can perceive what men can when they are looking at a comic book that employs the primary color palette. Now, they might think of it as boring, but they can still interact with it. But if you take your female color palette and apply it to a comic, your females will say, hey, that's really good. I like all of these colors. But the men will not be able to interact with it because their eyes are simply not set up to distinguish between that many colors, and everything just looks like mud blending together. So someone might say, well, who cares? You know, women deserve to have their own kind of comics as well. But the entire point is that this makes absolutely no sense in trying to put out a product in all of these things that we have just gone over. Because you have this color palette. If you make it for women, women might find it more exciting, but men will simply not be able to interact with it. If you put it in the primary color palette, which attracts men, men and women can actually interact with it. Women might see it as a little boring, but they can still interact with it. Whereas if you have the opposite, men cannot interact with it in the same way. And since the visual, we know, is more concentrated on by the men than the women, it really doesn't make any sense to put in this female color palette, because if you have these women and they're only concentrating on the visual 25 to 40% of the time, you are not going to attract that many more women because of a female color palette. But if you do that and put in this female color palette, since men are attracted to the visual 60 to 75% of the time, that is what they're looking for, that's what they're trying to interpret, you're going to drive them away. And more of those men will be driven away than the women that are attracted, because even if you assumed that the readership of comics is 50-50 male and female, if you put in a female color palette to attract more females, the number of females that you're going to attract is always going to be less than the number of men you're going to drive away, because men concentrate more on the visual than the women do. And yet still, these women who are making these comics want to employ these kinds of things in the construction of the medium of comics. Why? Well, because they ignore things like science. And it shouldn't be any surprise to us that they would ignore things like scientific facts, because they ignore the economic statistics that are sitting in front of them to tell them that these comics aren't selling, and they also ignore the statements of their fan base saying this is what we want. So if they're ignoring those things like what their fan base actually wants and the statistical numbers that tell them that their comics aren't selling, there's no wonder why they're ignoring science as well. But the bigger picture to this is the fact that when you get these kind of, we'll call them progressive-minded people, and they're thinking about how to construct a comic book, when they have questions about what will sell the best, they ignore the scientific. They ignore the statistical. They ignore what their fan base actually is telling them that they want. The only thing that actually answers the questions for them that they raise to themselves is their ideology. And we can clearly see this here with Kelly Sue DeConnick in her ridicule of the idea that there is any difference between men and women, because this is one of the main tenets of feminist ideology, that there is absolutely no difference whatsoever, even biologically, between a man and a woman. And this is the fundamental core of what Kelly Sue DeConnick is saying here. There is absolutely no difference between men and women whatsoever. Her ideology is claiming this, and she is putting that at the center of her argument of this is why we construct comics and the medium, the visual medium of comics in this way, because we assume that there is absolutely no difference between men and women, and therefore there's no way this can be driving away men, because men and women can interact with the visual medium of comic books in the exact same way, because our ideology teaches us that they are exactly the same. And so, I don't think that there is a concentrated effort where you have all of the colorists from Marvel getting together and having a meeting and saying, oh, let's use this feminine color palette so we can drive men away. No, it's nothing like that. It's simply that whenever a question arises in their mind, the only thing that is going to answer that question for them is their ideology. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.